Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is absolutely glorious to have you with us. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be in this room as well. This is the drawing room of Jane Austen's house, with reproduction of the original wallpaper that Austen herself would have known. And it was in this room in January 1813, when it was a very, very different temperature, that Austen and her mother read aloud from Austen's own copy of Pride and Prejudice, just as it had been published. So it's an absolute joy to be here and to talk about Austen and her work with Professor John Mullan, who has written on Austen extensively, including just a book that I read and was absolutely transformational for me with my understanding of Austen, and it brought so much to life, which is what matters in Jane Austen. And it really is an extraordinary text that I know for so many people has changed their perception of this author for the better, and it's been wonderful. And you've also done editing of Sense and Sensibility and Emma and just brought those texts to life, and you are going to talk with us this evening, and I will exit. Not pursued by that.
Thanks very much, Lizzie. Yes, and I'm going to talk about Pride and Prejudice and about something about Pride and Prejudice which maybe is almost there in the title, but I think is a sort of very animating thing about it, and a topic that I sort of chose before I most recently reread it. I reread Pride and Prejudice, I'm afraid, only every 2 years. But that means quite a few times by now. And having chosen this topic, character and contradiction in Pride and Prejudice, well, I found it everywhere. And I chose it in the belief, as I hope I'll illustrate this with the passages that I read out to you, that that contradiction and inconsistency are at the heart of what Jane Austen finds interesting about human characters, and what brings human characters alive and makes them seem to live quite apart from their author and their author's intention. In Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen creates a character, a heroine, Elizabeth Bennet, who is as interested in inconsistency and contradiction as Jane Austen is, although she finds that she too is susceptible to contradiction, as I hope I'll show. I thought I might start with one of her typically arch assertions, which she declares to the only half-comprehending Jane. She declares lots of things to the only half-comprehending Sister Jane, when, in some exasperation, she's thinking about Mr. Bingley's readiness to be diverted away from Jane, apparently by his friend, Mr. Darcy, and his two sisters, literally diverted. He's left Netherfield, apparently not to return. And she's thinking about that behaviour, and also her friend Charlotte Lucas's strange willingness to accept Mr. Collins as her husband. And Elizabeth says, every day confirms my belief of the inconsistency of all human characters. And that's what I want to explore in the next sort of 45 minutes, the inconsistency of at least the characters in this novel, and maybe we've got time for a couple of characters from some other Jane Austen novels. And a lot of the time, inconsistency, not just inconsistency, but flat self-contradiction, is essential to what makes a character funny and ridiculous. And of course, one of the funniest and most ridiculous and most entirely self-contradictory characters, I was going to say in this novel, in the world, in the history, is Mrs. Bennet, the very spirit, I think, of comic self-contradiction. I will spin a few examples your way. You could probably all think of your own, but here are a few choice ones. Elizabeth, early in the novel, when it appears that Mr. Bennet is not going to engineer an introduction to Mr. Bingley, who's just arrived as a tenant at Netherfield, Elizabeth tries to reassure her mother by reminding her that the bustling Mrs. Long, one of these many characters in Pride and Prejudice that you hear a lot about and never meet, never actually directly hear from, Mrs. Long has promised to introduce them to Mr. Bingley. And I'm sure you'll all remember Mrs. Bennet says, I do not believe Mrs. Long will do any such thing. She has two nieces of her own. She is a selfish, hypocritical woman, and I have no opinion of her. And of course, we all remember that when many chapters later, in the third volume, with Lydia already married in a shotgunish sort of way, and Mr Bingley and Mr Darcy returned upon the scene, Mrs Bennet in a much better mood, and hears from Mrs Long that Mrs Long thinks that Jane's prospects for Mr Bingley are good. We shall have her at Netherfield at last. In other words, Jane's got a good chance of marrying Mr Bingley. And this, of course, prompts Mrs Bennet to say exactly the opposite of what she said those few weeks earlier. I do think Mrs Long is as good a creature as ever lived, and her nieces are very pretty behaved girls, not at all handsome. I like them prodigiously. And this happens all the time, Mrs Bennet, doesn't it? And many of her contradictions are easier to notice because they're packed closer together. Sometimes they're only sentences apart or short time apart. Think of her reception of Mr Collins, that odious man, when his letter arrives the next day, treated with complacent smiles and general encouragement as she realises he's a prospective husband for one of her daughters. Now, we're supposed to listen out for inconsistency, I think, in Jane Austen novels, and the heroines are supposed to. I'm tempted to quiz you, I won't. I will say it rhetorically. Which two characters in Jane Austen, but it's a trick question, say the following within a couple of chapters of the very same novel? First of all, I hate money. Brilliant thing for a character to say. You know, just think, what kind of person says that? Actually says that. And then this person says, after all that romancers may say, there's no doing without money. Of course, it's not two characters, it's two versions of the same character, Isabella Thorpe in Northanger Abbey. Yes, and of course, when you hear, if you haven't noticed, the absurdity of the first sentence, I hate money, when you hear the second sentence, you might remember the first one and realise that somebody says, I hate money, must mean I like money very, very much indeed. Mrs Bennet is all contradictions. Think of her response, a brilliant response. I've compacted it here to news of Mr Collins's engagement to Charlotte Lucas. She has four responses, all in the same paragraph. First, it's not true. Second, Mr Collins has been tricked. Third, well, they'll never be happy together. And fourth, actually, the match might be broken off, you know. And each one contradicts the one before, and they just come in a stream from her. And rereading it this time, I noticed one or two new ones I hadn't noticed before. There's a great one when Mr Bennet has gone to London to try and trace Lydia, who's disappeared with Wickham and evidently not eloped to get married, but disappeared into London somewhere. And Mr Bennet goes to London, which of course we know he doesn't like doing, to try and find traces of them. And Mrs Bennet, we're told, yearns for her husband to return from London. And she says, and now here's Mr Bennet gone away, and I know he will fight Wickham wherever he meets him, and then he'll be killed. And what's to become of us all? Above all things, she says to her brother, Mr Gardiner, keep Mr Bennet from fighting. Well, then Mr Bennet's unsuccessful, and he does return. What? Is he coming home? And without poor Lydia? She cried. Sure, he'll not leave London before he's found them. Who's to fight Wickham and make him marry her if he comes away? Stay and fight. All the time, her invectives against the villainous conduct of Wickham. That's a phrase that Austen uses when she finds out that he's disappeared with her youngest daughter. Readily become, of course, just 2 chapters later, with the news of their marriage, exclamations about, dear, dear Wickham. Her comment on Mr Gardiner, I thought this was a lovely word, Mr Gardiner, who's apparently paid off Wickham. Of course, we find out that it's Mr Darcy who's done this, but everybody thinks that it's Mr Gardiner. And Mrs Bennet does not express gratitude. It is the first time we've ever had anything from him except a few presents. There's a bit of the sort of what did the Romans ever do for us aspect of Mrs. Bennet. Oh yeah, the roads. Oh yeah, the baths. Those few presents, you're invited to imagine, probably have been quite a few, and no doubt handsome ones at that. And of course, finally, not her fault perhaps, the contradiction of the self-contradiction into which she's forced when she finds out that her second eldest daughter is going to marry this man with £10,000 a year, Mr Darcy. Before she finds out about this, when when Mr Darcy returns with Mr Bingley, whom she sees rightly as the wooer of her daughter Jane, she says, well, any friend of Mr Bingley's will always be welcome here, to be sure. But else I must say I hate the very sight of him. And actually, I think, here's a new way of looking at Mrs Bennet. Quite a lot of the things that Mrs Bennet says, which are ridiculous for their earnest self-contradictoriness, if they'd been said by Elizabeth, we would think them very, very witty, actually. Think of this. Think of Elizabeth. Of course, she doesn't say this, but you can imagine Elizabeth's perfectly capable of saying, ironically, well, any friend of Mr Bingley's will always be welcome here, but else I may say I hate the very sight of him. I think quite a lot of Mrs Bennet's like that. What's ridiculous about what she says is that she doesn't see it comical. And of course, when he turns up as the fiancé of Elizabeth, she swiftly contradicts herself again. Such a charming man, so handsome, so tall. Casting around for an adjective, so tall, undeniably that. The solace of Mrs Bennet's life, we're told right at the beginning, is visiting a news, isn't it? So she, of course, is plugged in to Meryton opinion, which veers as easily as she does. And I want to turn now to sort of Meryton opinion, but with the warning note that actually Elizabeth, who is intelligent enough to scorn Meryton opinion, you might think, herself slips rather too easily into adopting it, as we'll hear. So I think when in Pride and Prejudice, at least, when we hear Jane Austen, rather than one of her characters, being ironical, it's almost always when we are hearing, as it were, Meryton opinion, what the world says, what people think. It is a truth universally acknowledged, all that stuff. Mr Wickham's society was of material service in dispelling the gloom which the late perverse occurrences had thrown on many of the long-born family. That's Mr Collins getting Charlotte Lucas getting Mr Collins instead of one of the Bennet girls. So at least they've still got Wickham around. They saw him often, and to his other recommendations was now added that of general unreserve. The whole of what Elizabeth had already heard from him about how Mr Darcy's done him down. Lies, 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 but still, nobody realises that yet. His claims on Mr Darcy and all that he had suffered from him was now openly acknowledged and publicly canvassed, and everybody was pleased to think how much they had always disliked Mr Darcy before they'd known anything of the matter. We were right. We were right. It's when we get to general opinion that you get Austen at her most ironical. And Elizabeth sort of half realises that and feels some awkwardness when her own opinion chimes too readily with that of everybody else in town. So after she's got Mr Darcy's letter, which I'm going to come back to at the end of this talk, she thinks about it, and she thinks about Wickham. She could see him instantly before her in every charm of air and address, but she could remember no more substantial good than the general approbation of the neighbourhood and the regard which his social powers had gained him in the mess. Fatal. Popular in the mess and with the other officers, of course, should be, as they say, a red flag. But the general approbation of the neighbourhood is something that should unsettle Elizabeth because, well, you know what the neighbourhood's like. After news of Wickham's flit with Lydia has circulated, Meryton, of course, does a sort of Mrs Bennet type 180-degree turn. All Meryton seems striving to blacken the man who but 3 months before had been almost an angel of light. He was declared to be in debt to every tradesman in the place, and his intrigues, all honoured with the title of seduction, had been extended into every tradesman's family. Everybody declared that he was the wickedest young man in the world, and everybody began to find out that they had always distrusted the appearance of his goodness. Everybody. And suddenly, everybody said he was wonderful before. Suddenly, every tradesman realises that he's in debt to them, and is, of course, the wickedest young man in the world. And when you hear something like that, you know that you're hearing something peculiarly implausible. So, too, when things turn out well after Jane gets engaged to Mr Bingley, the Bennets were speedily pronounced to be the luckiest family in the world, though only a few weeks before, when Lydia had first run away, they'd been generally proved to be marked out for misfortune. And these judgments of the community, as it were, are almost a joke when they are judgments on Mr Darcy. Remember, in just the second chapter of the novel, after they turn up at the assembly ball, Mr Darcy, nose in the air, refuses even to be introduced to somebody so that he might dance with them. His character was decided. He was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, and everybody hoped that he would never come there again. So we're given every chance to hear something wrong with this. So Jane Austen is actually doing something both broadly comical and also, I think, quite very subtle, which is she's allowing Mr Darcy to behave badly and for us to dislike him, but she's always also allowing us to hear something absurd at the speed with which characters, unnamed characters here in the community, leap to their conclusions. And it's a nice little twist that, you know, Jane Bennet, who's always trying to think well of people, and therefore is always being wrong, is sometimes right. Maybe it's on the same principle as a clock being right twice a day, but still she turns out to be sort of right about Mr Darcy. Because after Wickham's fiction of his mistreatment by Mr Darcy becomes known, Jane puzzles over how to explain Mr Darcy's conduct away. And Austen says, by everybody else, Mr Darcy was condemned as the worst of men. Not just bad, but the worst of men. And that everybody else means everybody else, including Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, she almost realises that this worst in the world stuff has to be a bit ridiculous. There's a moment when she's talking to her Aunt Gardiner about the attractions of Wickham, and she suddenly exclaims in the middle of talking about Wickham, "Oh, that abominable Mr Darcy." The sort of thing you might well say about something you quite fancy, actually. Abominable. Especially somebody like Elizabeth, who knows that abominable is a playfully hyperbolical adjective. And you feel when you hear her say this, careful as you go. While she's staying at Netherfield, because her sister's ill, Elizabeth notices that Mr Darcy is spending lots of time looking at her. She could only imagine, however, at last, that she drew his notice because there was something about her more wrong and reprehensible, according to his ideas of right, than in any other person present. The supposition did not pain her. She liked him too little to care for his approbation. And those two little sentences at the end, of course, as I'm sure Jane Austen connoisseurs here present will know, is another little example of that technique that Jane Austen arguably invented, free indirect styles it's called, where the narrative takes on the habits of thought of one of the characters, not Elizabeth thought to herself, the supposition doesn't pain me, but an assertion of fact which reflects her own view, and of course her own slightly wrong view. And of course it's one of those sentences, and there are many in Pride and Prejudice, which I think if you read the novel for a second or third or whatever time, has a different voltage from when you read the novel for the first time. The supposition didn't pain her, really? She liked him too little to care for his approbation. Sounds much more on the second reading like what she tells herself than what Jane Austen is telling us. And that's it. It is entirely what she tells herself. And of course, the extraordinary thing about Pride and Prejudice, one of the most extraordinary things, which is the reason that the filmmakers so adore it, I think, is that you have this irreverent, intelligent, ironical, self-confident character who is in some ways deceiving herself about her own feelings. But you're not told that. You have to experience it as you read. Elizabeth's not the only admirable character in Jane Austen's fiction who has feelings that contradict what they tell themselves. Here's a little example. This is Captain Wentworth in Persuasion. It's an extraordinary little passage in Persuasion at the end of chapter 7 when, for the first and only time, Austen takes you into Captain Wentworth's mind, and then she never does it again. So she tells you something about what he's thinking, and then she doesn't tell you anything else about what he's thinking. And the thing that she tells you about what he's thinking is not true. Here it is. And it's about Captain Wentworth talking to his sister, Mrs. Croft, about what he's looking for in a wife. And it's not Anne Elliot, it doesn't say that, but that's what he's thinking. And then it tells you what he thinks about Anne Elliot now. He had been most warmly attached to her and had never seen a woman since whom he thought her equal. But except for some natural sensation of curiosity, he had no desire of meeting her again. Her power with him was gone forever. Very simple sentence. How brilliant it is. It's completely untrue. But we, like the heroine of a novel, have to discover how untrue it is. Because that sentence, although it's in the third person, although we might think it's Jane Austen telling us, is him telling himself, of course. And he's doomed to contradict himself. There are lots of these sort of self-contradictions amongst what we might think of as good people, virtuous characters or sympathetic characters, and they're not necessarily absurd at all. They can feel, I think, sometimes a bit like Jane Austen teaching a character a lesson. I think most notably in Sense and Sensibility, think of the self-contradiction with which that novel ends. The self-contradiction that Marianne Dashwood has to learn. Marianne Dashwood was born to an extraordinary fate. She was born to discover the falsehood of her own opinions and to counteract, by her conduct, her most favourite maxims. And marry the man with the flannel waistcoat. Inconsistency is in a way the whole point, the whole interest of Pride and Prejudice. And as I suggested at the beginning, I think Elizabeth herself is rather a connoisseur of it. I mean, she says that. She tells Mr Darcy that inconsistency is what she relishes in others. Follies and nonsense, whims and inconsistencies do divert me, I own, and I laugh at them whenever I can. But these, I suppose, are precisely what you are without. Be careful, though. Be careful, Elizabeth Bennet, for we can relish yours as well as you relish others. At one point, actually, Jane Austen seems to me almost herself to note her heroine's inconsistency. She's almost on the brink of warning her own heroine about it. And that's where Elizabeth finds herself quite willing to forgive. She's magnanimous about Wickham going off in pursuit of an heiress, a woman with money, and showing no longer any interest in her. So she's sort of magnanimous about his pursuing this wealthy young woman in preference to her. And the novel says, Elizabeth, less clear-sighted perhaps in his case than in Charlotte's, did not quarrel with him for his wish of independence. So she's appalled that Charlotte Lucas has married for money, but is apparently forgiving about Wickham doing it. As I said if you saw it on the website, my enticing blurb for this talk, even our heroine is therefore doomed to contradict herself. And I said in that blurb, but I think it's worth saying it again, that lovely example from chapter 5 of Pride and Prejudice, which when I first read it, and I think I hadn't ever seen a film of it, I didn't know the story, I can't remember noticing this particular sentence, but I definitely wouldn't have noticed that this was necessarily an impending self-contradiction, because it's after the Assembly ball and they are analysing Mr Darcy's appalling behaviour, and Mrs Bennet prompts Elizabeth to an unwise avowal. Another time, Lizzie, said her mother, I would not dance with him if I were you. I believe, Ma'am, I may safely promise you never to dance with him. And of course, it's not a safe promise. She's being, as she might herself say, she's being serious indeed. The only other time she addresses her mother as Ma'am, could make this a good quiz question, but you would all get it, I'm sure, is when she begs her not to leave her alone in the room with Mr Collins. Dear Ma'am, do not go. Ma'am is a sort of affectionately formal term for not just your mother, you can call somebody else's mother Ma'am too. But I believe, Ma'am, I may safely promise you never to dance with him is a serious assertion, and of course she's doomed to contradict this. It's a contradiction that catches out Mr Darcy too. No sooner has he told Sir William Lucas that he never dances if he can avoid it. It is a compliment which I never pay to any place if I can avoid it. You fool. And immediately we find him contradicting himself. Mr Darcy, says Sir William, you must allow me to present this young lady to you as a very desirable partner. You cannot refuse to dance, I am sure, when so much beauty is before you. And taking her hand, he would have given it to Mr Darcy, who, though extremely surprised, was not unwilling to receive it. We know where all this leads, don't we? It leads to the Netherfield ball, and it leads to a really fine example of that technique of free and direct style where we catch at Elizabeth's self-deception. She danced next with an officer and had the refreshment of talking of Wickham and of hearing that he was universally liked. When those dances, red flag again, yes, universally liked. Don't we worry a bit about that by the other officers? When those dances were over, she returned to Charlotte Lucas and was in conversation with her when she found herself suddenly addressed by Mr Darcy, who took her so much by surprise in his application for her hand that, without knowing what she did, she accepted him. He walked away again immediately, and she was left to fret over her own want of presence of mind. Oh, what have I done? He was just so quick, you see. So quick, I didn't quite know what was... And he is. He doesn't ask her, and he asks her, but he doesn't make any sort of conversational approach before the request, dashes in, pops the question. She doesn't even have time to think what she's doing. This most self-conscious and knowing what she's doing character tells herself, but it's only by a sort of inadvertence that she's accepted his hand for the dance. It's a sort of vignette of unconscious self-contradiction. And again, the first-time reader is hardly likely to notice, certainly the first-time reader who is not acquainted with any screen version will not notice, I think, that this is another example, not of Jane Austen telling us something, but of Jane Austen letting us glimpse or overhear Elizabeth telling herself something. And why should contradictoriness not be part of Elizabeth's character, after all? For a complete lack of inconsistency or contradiction is actually a kind of warning sign. And Elizabeth belatedly realises this when she's read Mr Darcy's letter and becomes suspicious of Wickham and meets him again. She had even learned to detect in the very gentleness which at first delighted her an affectation and a sameness to disgust and weary. He's always the same. Of course he is. He's always the same because he's always acting a part. There's no contradiction, no inconsistency, no truth, no reality in his character. So actually contradictoriness is what brings character alive. And Jane Austen obviously relished it. Here's a little snippet from a letter she wrote to her niece, Fanny Knight, in 1817. You are the paragon of all that is silly and sensible, commonplace and eccentric, sad and lively, provoking and interesting. Who can keep pace with the fluctuations of your fancy, the capriccios of your taste, the contradictions of your feelings? You are so odd, and all the time so perfectly natural, so peculiar to yourself, and yet so like everybody else. It is very, very gratifying to me to know you so intimately. Well, it'd be great to get a letter like that, wouldn't it? Odd. You hear the word odd? That must ring a bell. I'm sure it rings a bell with you, because it sends me back to one of my very favourite sentences in Pride and Prejudice, right at the end of that, just unparalleled first chapter of the novel, where a man and wife talk to each other, and all they do is talk to each other, with hardly even a he said, she said. You just hear them. And at the end of it, you've got it, haven't you? You've got their marriage. And Jane Austen rounds it off with some comments on the two of them, including this wonderful sentence, I think, about Mr Bennet, which plays on the word odd again. Mr Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humour, reserve and caprice, that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. And fantastic combination. Quick parts, sarcastic humour, reserve and caprice. And you think, what an extraordinary concoction. This person exists. They must exist to deserve such a strange, surprising, but utterly precise mixture of descriptive terms, which, of course, partly contradict each other, reserve and caprice. And this in a novel where actually it turns out, but of course, understanding another person's character is part of the challenge as well as the play that the leading characters enter into. Elizabeth says to Charlotte Lucas, and they talk about Jane, and this is the conversation where Charlotte Lucas says, you know, that famous thing, time enough for falling in love after you've got married. And she's saying, you know, she knows him well enough, he knows her well enough, get going. And Elizabeth says she danced 4 dances with him at Meryton. She saw him one morning at his own house and has since dined in company with him 4 times. This is not quite enough to make her understand his character. Understanding character is essential, of course. You're going to live with this person forever. But also for Elizabeth, it's a kind of enjoyment. And what I want to suggest in the last part of this talk is that, in a way, gives you a glimpse, mainly through our sense of her as a character, that a really interesting character might just be endlessly interesting, not somebody we can nail in a paragraph, but somebody who might go on forever beguiling us. Elizabeth enjoys discussing character. And Mr. Bingley says to her in chapter 9, "I did not know before that you were a studier of character. It must be a most amusing study." And Mr. Darcy also doesn't quite understand either what this is about. And he sort of suggests that, you know, if that's what she's into, then it's a pity that she lives where she does. "The country," said Darcy, "can in general supply but few subjects for such a study. In a country neighbourhood, you move in a very confined and unvarying society." And Elizabeth retorts, "But people themselves alter so much. There's something new to be observed in them forever." And that's what character is for her, something endlessly fascinating. She likes intricacy, she says, of character, most of all. And you know, even as she says it, that Mr. Darcy is a case study for her of this. And indeed, she shows her love of intricacy of character most tellingly with respect to him. There's a great moment where you suddenly have a sort of little glimpse into the sort of devil inside Mr. Darcy. When Mr. Bingley is explaining, they're all talking together at Netherfield. This is during Jane's illness. Mr. Bingley's explaining why he defers to Mr. Darcy. And he says, first of all, he says he's really tall. And then he also says, "I declare, I do not know a more awful object than Darcy on particular occasions and in particular places, at his own house especially, and of a Sunday evening when he has nothing to do." Mr. Darcy smiled, but Elizabeth thought she could perceive that he was rather offended and therefore checked her laugh. Miss Bingley warmly resented the indignity he had received in an expostulation with her brother for talking such nonsense. Not nonsense, of course. Not nonsense at all. I mean, nonsense in that it is playful talk, but not nonsense in the sense that it gives us a little glimpse, doesn't it, of the ennui of an unsatisfied mind. Evidently, his picture of Mr. Darcy in a gloomy mood on a Sunday evening, and I kind of know the feeling, is utterly believable. Feeding on his own thoughts. It's anything but nonsense. And also, characterfully, this paragraph shows us, dramatises us something really interesting, I think, that we all notice on a first reading, about Elizabeth seeing something concealed. She thinks she can perceive that he was rather offended and checks her laugh. One of those many points at which we might say, "I thought you said you didn't like him." You'll all know how many times Mr. Darcy smiles in the novel. I'm sure you do know. He smiles 12 times in the novel, if you count the painting, 11 times if you don't. This is the only time in the novel where he smiles not at Elizabeth. Every other time he smiles at her. Remember, he says that Jane Bennet, he comments early on that Jane Bennet smiles too much, but with Elizabeth he can't help smiling, and he smiles always at her except here. And here is the one moment where his smile is not a real smile, she realises. So you see something about his character, or rather, much more interesting, you see something about her seeing something about his character and seeing something which immediately Miss Bingley tries to cancel out because she doesn't understand at all. She doesn't understand at all. And there are several moments in the novel, aren't there, where Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth are involved in a conversation and the other person in the room just doesn't understand what they're talking about. Great great one at Rosings where Lady Catherine keeps saying, what are you saying? What are you saying? And they're playing with words in a way that the other people in the room aren't qualified to do. As they dance together at the Netherfield Ball, what do they talk about? They talk about each other's characters. And rhetorical question, what in a sense can be a more flirtatious thing to do than to talk to somebody about their character and have them talk to you back about what they think about your character? She tells Mr Darcy that she's asking him odd questions for the illustration of your character. I'm trying to make it out. No wonder he likes her. Much later, when they meet again in Kent at Rosings, Elizabeth seems to forget how much she hates him, and they engage in some mutual teasing, all again about each other's characters. And he says, you find great enjoyment in occasionally professing opinions which are in fact not your own. And we might call it irony, I suppose, which is, of course, a key bond that they share. Elizabeth laughs heartily when he says this. And you get, I think, a little sense here, and this is when Elizabeth officially still dislikes him, that what it might be like for two people to find each other endlessly interesting. They are trying to nail each other's characters, but not really finally trying to sort of put the lid on the box, but playing around with the irony and indirection that they are capable of showing to each other and that nobody else quite grasps. Elizabeth says in response, I'm particularly unlucky. And of course she's talking to him, but in front of others. I'm particularly unlucky in meeting with a person so well able to expose my real character in a part of the world where I'd hope to pass myself off with some degree of credit. So self-analysis is also part of the kind of game that these two play with each other. Or Mr Darcy has to learn how to play it because, of course, initially his accounts of his own character are hilariously pompous and solemn. Remember his accounts of what his faults might be. But he gets better, I think, at this. And I wanted to end, having concentrated on the way they sort of playfully talk to each other, I wanted to end by talking a little bit about the drama of self-contradiction in Pride and Prejudice when, as it goes on in Elizabeth's own mind, in introspection. And I think this is a technique that Austen was just beginning to develop in Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, but which she became much more interested in later on in her last two completed novels, Emma and Persuasion. And I wanted to move aside just for a second before I do my last example from Pride and Prejudice to an example from Emma, I think of where she was headed, where her treatment of Elizabeth's thoughts to herself took her, well, by the time she got to her fourth completed novel. So this is Emma in that novel, and this is in sort of quite near the middle of the novel. And what's happened is Harriet Smith, her stooge, her protege, has come in all of a flutter because she's taken shelter from the rain in Ford's, in the shop in the town village, Highbury, and into the shop have come Mr. Robert Martin, the man who proposed marriage to her, the proposal that Emma persuaded her to turn down, and Mr. Robert Martin's sister. And they're there at the other end of the shop. And Harriet describes how they sort of whisper to each other And then apparently at Mr. Robert Martin's instigation, the sister comes across and talks to her, at first rather awkwardly, but then in a more friendly way. And Harriet finds it all too flustering, and she leaves the shop. And as she leaves, Mr. Robert Martin comes out and says, oh, by the way, if you're going to Hartfield, go by the upper road because the lower one's flooded after the rain. She goes, oh, so kind of him. And of course, we know that the one thing Harriet Smith can't do is say anything untrue, ironical, indirect, subtle. She's the most reliable witness there is. And Emma knows that. But listen to how Emma manages to contradict herself in her mind before we have a final example of Elizabeth doing it. She was obliged to stop and think. She was not thoroughly comfortable herself. The young man's conduct and his sister's seemed the result of real feeling, and she could not but pity them. As Harriet described it, there'd been an interesting mixture of wounded affection and genuine delicacy in their behaviour. But she had believed them to be well-meaning, worthy people before. And what difference did this make in the evils of the connection? It was folly to be disturbed by it. Of course, he must be sorry to lose her. They must all be sorry. Ambition, as well as love, had probably been mortified. They might all have hoped to rise by Harriet's acquaintance. And besides, what was the value of Harriet's description? So easily pleased, so little discerning. What signified her praise? She managed to get all the way from Harriet has told me something true to who cares what Harriet said. And she's done it by stages of sort of baffling herself, really. Self-contradiction there is self-deception, which is, of course, what that novel, Emma, is so much about. But in Pride and Prejudice, self-contradiction is also a kind of necessity when you discover you've been wrong. And I thought I'd end with an example of that right at the heart of the novel, which is in a way the real happy ending of Pride and Prejudice, or rather the moment that makes happy endings possible. She reads a letter from Mr Darcy which explains his conduct and which in which he vindicates himself in relation to Mr Wickham and his treatment and Wickham's obvious caddishness. And her first thing is, remember, she's read it. I'm not going to read it again. She would never look in it again, but it would not do. Yeah, I think it's no accident. This is another lecture. Mr Darcy and Elizabeth quite often use the same sort of phrases, actually. It will not do. Do you remember he says when he, in vain have I struggled. It will not do when he makes his disastrous proposal. So Elizabeth's not speaking here, she's thinking. She would never look in it again, but it would not do. She uses the same turn of phrase. She has to. And she's the kind of character who can't be satisfied. Of course she can't be satisfied with the untruth that she would prefer to believe. She has to pursue the truth that's more uncomfortable. This happy sort of prelude to a happy ending happens just over halfway through the novel, as I said. And it's where Elizabeth learns to contradict her earlier self. And after the chapter, she's walking around, she's reading it again, she's thinking it through, and wonderful couple of sentences with which I'll end, where she's finally realised by the sort of forensic power of her reading what something like the truth must be. She grew absolutely ashamed of herself. Of neither Darcy nor Wickham could she think without feeling that she'd been blind, partial, prejudiced, absurd. And again, it's a great collection of adjectives 4 adjectives because it's another example of not Jane Austen telling us something, but letting us experience the drama of Elizabeth's thoughts. Blind, partial prejudice. She keeps hammering away because she realises what a complete series of errors she's made. But the coup de grace, the Elizabeth Bennet adjective par excellence to end it, absurd. The worst thing of all she's been is ridiculous, a laughing stock to herself, as it were. That second sentence of neither Darcy nor Wickham could she think without feeling that she'd been blind, partial, prejudiced, absurd, in a way is unlike anything that any novelist before Austen could have written, and leaves us to not just to know, but to experience the truth that sometimes the best thing a person can do is to contradict themselves. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. I have been privileged to hear you speak on a number of occasions, as well as to read your work. Every single time you open new avenues to Austen and you just enhance understanding and reading, and it's just...
It's her.
She's so much.
It's her. I ride on her coattails.
Oh, I know, but she is such an icon in her own way, and in some way, by becoming iconic, she flattens.
Yeah.
And I think that so much of your work, you bring her into 3D. And just not just as a person, well, not particularly as an author. And I think it's just phenomenal. I always learn so much and learn, to quote another John, a new way of seeing, which is phenomenal. And we do have some questions, and I'm going to start with one from our online and social audience, and then I will turn to our audience here. And I think you've answered this in many ways, but I'd still like to hear a soundbite from you, if this is okay, which is... what made Pride and Prejudice a revolutionary text? And why is it still one today?
Okay. Well, maybe I can answer with always the best answer is an example from Jane Austen.
Yes.
And I was thinking about this, I was walking the dog the other day, and that's where all my deep thoughts come, and the shallow ones as well. And it's a famous moment. And I just think it sort of captures what's revolutionary about this novel, about Jane Austen, and in a way that actually a new reader who knows nothing about the history of the English novel at all, who's never read an earlier novel, will still experience afresh. And it's that moment where Mr Darcy at the Meryton Assembly Ball goes, "Not handsome enough for me," and Elizabeth goes off and laughs about it. And, you know, if it had been Fanny Burney, the heroine would have been consoled for her mortification by a very cardboard cutout, virtuous, aristocratic man there. If it had been Mary Wollstonecraft, she would have fumed inwardly and rightly at the absurd, preening arrogance of men. Elizabeth goes off and laughs and tells all her friends about it. And in its way, I think the first-time reader knows how revolutionary that is, don't they? They know. No heroines behaved like that before. And it's sort of one of those things which anybody reading it, and certainly I think people reading it at the time, felt just like, as they say, blowing the doors off, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I could give some more literary critical answers, but I think that catches it, really, what's so extraordinary about it.
Thank you so much. Does anybody with us today have any questions?
Which is your favourite? Who is your favourite?
Who is my favourite character, or which is my favourite novel? Both. Gosh, well, I suppose. I mean, I'm writing a lecture at the moment for the Bath Jane Austen Festival. Perhaps I shouldn't say that. Perhaps they're your rivals, but called Jane Austen's Monsters, and you'll know what I mean by that. That the monstrous characters in Jane Austen, arguably Mrs. Bennet's one and Lydia's one, are characters that in life you would hide behind a wall to avoid, but in the novel, you cheer as soon as they come into the room. And I have to say, when Mrs. Elton and Emma comes into the room, I just, put out the streamers and I blow the trumpet. So I have a special affection for monsters, and she's not like Mrs. Norris is a monster, but she's a sadist. Mrs. Elton, that does have a sadistic side to her, actually, her endless sort of Jane stuff, but she's also just, a vulgar triumph, isn't she? So I do. And of course, again, this is the topic of another talk or perhaps a discussion amongst all of us over the Pims, but Mr. Bennet, he is a special favourite in a really interesting way to me, but I think to most readers, in that when you reread Pride and Prejudice, when you start, having read it before, that it's all Mr. Bennet's fault. It's actually all Mr. Bennet's fault. He lets his daughter 1 month past her 16th birthday go to Brighton with another teenager. I mean, I wouldn't let my daughters go to Brighton now when they're in their 20s. No, it's a place of terrible sinfulness. Everybody knows that. When he should be there watching what they're up to at these balls and who they're cavorting with, he's at home, sort of reading Gibbon or something, I imagine. He hasn't saved any money. It's all his fault. But having read it once, you know that, and that he's only saved by good luck and Mr. Darcy from disaster. But every time you read it again, you think, oh, he's so amusing. I do so love him. Even though you recognise it.
Back to that contradiction.
Yeah,
Isn't it?
yeah.
It's genuine.
Yeah. My favourite novel, I guess, is Emma, because it seems to me, because I'm an academic, and it's the most complicated and perfect and minute and longest, one. And it seems to me that when she wrote that, with Pride and Prejudice is her funniest, I think, and in most ways her most simply enjoyable and liberating. But you can see she's still trying out some things, I think. And I think when she got to Emma, she could do anything. It's like Shakespeare doing Hamlet, and she could do anything. And she no longer gave a moment's thought to what any other novelist had ever done. She only influenced herself now. I just think it's incredible.
I'm actually going to stop there. There's all sorts of other questions, but I think you can't go any further than Jane Austen was incredible. And I'm going to call it a day there.
Okay,
Thank you
thanks
so
very
much,
much.
John. It's been absolutely incredible.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.